Hi everyone, my name is Xavier Guinard and I'm a professor of sensory science at the University of California at Davis. And today I'm going to be talking about consumer-driven product optimization and breakthrough innovation. So this is the outline for the presentation. We're going to start by discussing coffee sensory evaluation and the different approaches we use to assess the sensory quality of coffee. Then we will move into the word of the day, which is consumer testing and consumer research. And more specifically, we will then show you how we are going to use that consumer research and those consumer tests to optimize existing products or develop brand new ones, what we're calling product optimization and breakthrough innovation. So let's start by talking about the sensory evaluation of coffee. Currently, there are three ways we do this. One is what we would call quality ratings by experts. Another one is descriptive analysis by a trained panel. And then the third approach is to go before the consumer and ask how they like or dislike the products. So let's talk about each of these three ways of doing coffee sensory evaluation. The first way is quality ratings by experts. And you're all familiar with those techniques. We're talking about cupping and quality graders. For example, the Specialty Coffee Association standards and quality scale, and then Coffee Quality Institute's Q grading. We're also coming up with our own way of assessing coffee sensory quality, which we're calling Coffee Quality, and you can consult it at coffeequality.com. What we're showing on this slide is the standard scale that is used by the Specialty Coffee Association, and you basically come up with a score on 100 points, and we get some additional information about how this score is broken down. So that's one way we can assess quality of coffee with experts coming up with a score out of 100 points. The second way we do sensory evaluation of coffee is what we call descriptive analysis. In descriptive analysis, a panel of 5 to 10 what we call users and likers of the product is going to be trained for anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months, and is going to learn to identify and then rate the intensities of the sensory attributes in the product. So in the case of coffee, they might start with the Coffee Taster's Flavor Wheel, which was developed by our own Molly Spencer, and which you see on this slide, and which has a list of the attributes that might be pertinent to the flavor of coffee. So that trained panel will learn to rate the intensities of those attributes, no judgment of quality or of liking. And then we will use all kinds of statistics, univariate and multivariate statistics, to sort out the differences among the products and the relationships among the sensory attributes. So we come up with things called spiderweb plots or sensory maps, which are derived from basic statistics or more advanced ones like principal component analysis. Here is an example. This is what I would refer to as a sensory map, or something that's derived from principal component analysis of a matrix of attribute sensory ratings across the coffees. So on this slide, we're showing you two diagrams. One that shows the distribution of a set of coffees that varied in things like TDS and percent extraction and brewing temperature. And then another plot that shows you the sensory attributes and how they are positioned in relation to those products. You can see attributes like brown roast, citrus, sour, berry, bitter, and so on. And then you can see where on that particular map the different coffees would fall. So this is like coming up with a sensory ID of the coffees using those descriptive analysis ratings. The third way in which we're going to approach assessing coffee sensory quality is to ask the consumer. And that's going to be the bottom line, because he or she is the ultimate user and drinker of the coffee. So we now are going to talk about consumer testing. In consumer testing, we can use, broadly speaking, two types of approaches. One that I would call quantitative, where we use scales for consumers to answer questions and produce numbers. And then we can analyze those numbers, and so we talk about a quantitative approach. Those numbers can come from something like the 9-point hedonic scale, which is shown on the slide, that goes from dislike extremely to like extremely. And then we can also ask consumers how they feel about specific sensory attributes, which we know to be key to the acceptance of the coffee. So, for example, the floral or fruity flavor, the chocolate or caramel flavor. And then we can ask them to use so-called just right scales, where they have the option of saying the coffee is too low, just right, or too high in terms of its sweetness or its fruity character. We can also use check on that apply scales. In this case, we show a list of attributes or descriptors of the flavor of the coffee to the consumer and ask them just circle the ones that are relevant to the coffee you just tasted. This is sort of an indirect approach to mapping the sensory attributes of the coffee, but this time we do it with consumers. And then we have the whole qualitative approach, which we will spend a bit of time on today, which include things like focus groups or projective techniques, for example, psychodrawing or role-playing or name associations. And then we have individual interviews, and then the holy grail of qualitative research for me, which is observation or ethnography, including online observation or so-called nethnography. So those are the three main ways we're going to do sensory testing of coffee. And today we're going to focus on the consumer piece. Just to provide some background on how we approach it, we designed a consumer research model a few years back, which considers that consumer behavior, whether it's liking or whether it's consumption or the pleasure that one derives from that cup of coffee, is going to be determined by three sets of variables. What we call product variables, which could be the bitter taste of the coffee, or it could be the price of the coffee. Consumer variables, your demographics, your psychographics. Do you vote Republican or Democrat? Do you prefer to sit on the aisle or on the window when you fly? These are what we call psychographics. And then we have genetics and physiology. So those are so-called consumer variables. And then there is a third piece which is extremely important, particularly for coffee, and that's what we call context. The third set of variables, which can be the physical context, it can also be the societal context, and in that case, we're going to, instead of measuring that context or manipulating it, which is not always easy, we're going to try to monitor how those different context variables would affect the consumer behavior. So three sets of variables: product, consumer, and context variables. Are you having that cup of coffee in the comfort of your home, or are you in a very nice cafe somewhere in Florence? And then what we find is that culture sort of overlaps consumer variables and context variables. And so we do a lot of cross-cultural research so that we create some variance, which then allows us to study those phenomena by having the adequate amount of variance in our data. And then because this is such a complex model, we're going to be using a lot of statistics to sort things out, a lot of multivariate statistics. And then we're going to want to have both those qualitative and those quantitative approaches to understanding the consumer. So I'm going to show you some examples of how we design those consumer tests when we do quantitative research. And this is illustrated by some work we did with one of my graduate students, Andrew Carter, who did a big piece of research looking at the effect of TDS, percent extraction, and brewing temperature on consumer liking for black coffee. So we did this over several weekends because consumers had to taste many different coffees, 27 in total. We had 118 consumers in our test, and then they rated a number of things And this is an important piece because in addition to getting that overall liking rating by the consumer, we are then going to collect that additional information that helps us make sense of that liking rating. And then when the consumer is done, we also check those consumer variables by having them complete what we call an exit survey. And in an exit survey, we ask again about those demographics, those habits, how often you consume coffee, what kind, and so on, so that we can make sense of the preferences that we're going to map from those consumers. Here we show you what a typical tasting ballot looks like for our consumer work. And we've put a lot of thought into this because, again, we want to try to make as much sense as possible of that overall liking rating. So we do indeed ask how much do you like or dislike the coffee overall, and consumers will use that 9-point hedonic scale or any other liking scale to answer that question. We then ask about specific attributes and the adequacy of those attributes. How do you feel about the flavor intensity of this coffee? Is it too low, just right, or too high? How do you feel about the acidity of the coffee, the mouthfeel, and so on? And then we have the CATA exercise, the check all that apply exercise, where we're going to have a list of about 15 to 18 attributes covering the flavor and the mouthfeel of the coffee, and then the consumer is going to circle the ones that apply. And to wrap things up, we ask them, how likely would you be to purchase the 12-ounce cup of this coffee from your favorite coffee shop for $3? Definitely would purchase, definitely would not purchase, or maybe, maybe not. So that's our typical ballot when we run a quantitative consumer test. We now get into the promise that I made when I read my title, which is how are we going to use that consumer data to optimize or renovate an existing coffee, and then how are we going to innovate and create new coffee market segments from breakthrough innovation? What kind of methods do we apply to do this? When we talk about product optimization, I'll give you two examples of techniques that we use very often. One is called response surface methodology, and the other one is called preference mapping, or preference mapping and clustering. The warning that both of these techniques require quite a few products and a whole bunch of consumers. So this is something that we typically do for research, but that mid-sized to large companies or multinational companies engage in quite a bit. If you have a small specialty coffee shop, some of the other techniques we're going to talk about might be more appropriate and easier for you to implement. So with response surface methodology, we start with the idea that liking for just about any food or beverage product is related to several key ingredients or sensory attributes in an inverted U-shaped fashion. When there is too little of it, you don't like it. Somewhere in the middle, you like it the best. And then if there is too much of it, you don't like it either. So we don't see a linear relationship between liking and attribute intensities. And so as a result of that, we need to have a model that allows for these nonlinear relationships to be built. So we can relate liking for a product to the levels of a couple of key ingredients or attributes using the following model, which is shown on the slide. So from that equation, we can build different kinds of response surfaces that best fit the way the consumer likes or dislikes the product as a function of these ingredients or attributes. And we can have a dome response surface, as shown on this slide, where we show liking for lemonade as a function of, guess what? Sugar and acid. And we can also have saddle-shaped response surfaces or cradle response surfaces, depending on how things vary as a function of those ingredients. So you can see how we can use that technique to optimize the level of those ingredients and maximize liking. The second technique, which often goes hand in hand with the previous one, is what we call preference mapping or preference clustering. And there the idea is that we don't all like the same coffee. And that applies to just about any food or beverage product. There are different likes and dislikes among consumers from any population. So some of you might like your coffee very bitter and not sweet at all. You might go for something that's more on the chocolatey side and less on the fruity or floral side. But other people might actually like that much better. So for us to try to make one perfect cup of coffee, one ideal cup of coffee, is going to be somewhat pointless. And it's a central message of this presentation. So with preference mapping, we explore that. What we do is we try to understand market segmentation, preference segmentation. How many groups of consumers with different likes and dislike patterns do we have in our market? The second piece is that we then try to identify drivers of liking for the preference segments that we've uncovered through that analysis. And then, if we've done a good job with our exit survey, we can then characterize the preference segments in terms of demographics, psychographics, and usage. And if we've understood how many segments we had, what drove liking by each of these segments, and who are the people in these segments, we can then design the right coffee and then market it to them much more effectively. So on this slide, we show you an example of such a preference map, an internal preference map. So you see a bunch of arrows, and then you see a number of codes that represent the different coffees in our experiment. And without going into detail into what those coffees are, you can see that they're spread out on that map. What is also very much spread out are the arrows that represent the main direction of liking for each consumer in the test. So each of these arrows, whether it's short or long, whether it's going left or right, represent what that consumer likes the most or dislikes the most at the opposite end. And what you can see is that the arrows are distributed all over this map. So indeed, not everybody likes the same coffee. And that's preference mapping and its purpose. So what we can then do with that data is to find out how many clusters of consumers we have with different liking patterns. And so we did this in this slide. And when we run what we call a cluster analysis, we have to make some judgment calls. But in this case, we decided that there are two different preference clusters. So this so-called dendrogram that you see on the slide, where each of these little lines represents one consumer, shows you how they get classified based on their liking patterns. And we have two different preference clusters, one with about 51 consumers, the other one with 67 consumers. And these are shown on the previous slide, the same diagram we showed you on the previous slide, as red and blue arrows. And then, not to crowd the diagram, we show you the coffees on the slide next to it. And so you can see who are the consumers in those two different clusters. And you can see that they go for different things on that preference map. So what we can do then is to circle back to the first technique, response surface methodology, and relate liking by each of these clusters to the different types of variables that were used to make those coffees: TDS, percent extraction, and brewing temperature. So what do we find when we do that? So first, we can just plot the average liking for the different coffees and each of the two preference clusters we uncovered. And we can see that TDS was a big driver of the preferences of our consumers. PE to a smaller extent, and then brewing temperature didn't matter one bit. I know that might sound surprising, but that's the way it was. So why do we circle back to response surface methodology? Because as you will hear in a different presentation by Professor Ristenpart, we're interested in that brewing control chart and the center point that says that there is an ideal coffee in the middle. So first, the thinking that there would be an ideal coffee, hopefully we've dismissed that by showing that there is always going to be a fairly wide range of preferences the different types of coffees among any group of consumers. So to think that one size fits all is not going to work. And so once we've uncovered the different clusters, we can then relate their liking to those two key variables in the brewing control chart, percent extraction and total dissolved solids, or strength of the brew. And what happens when we do that? We can plot those response surfaces for our two consumer clusters. And the first one is shown on the left. That's cluster number 1. And then the second one is shown on the right, cluster number 2. And I'll start with this one because it's easier. What we're showing in this two-dimensional representation is that liking goes up as we move towards the lower left corner of the brewing control chart. So that group of consumer is going to prefer something that has a low TDS and a low to medium percent extraction. So a nice dome response surface, and we can identify where the maximum is, and we can brew that coffee for them fairly easily. The other group is a bit more complex because we get what we call a saddle response surface, where we have two optima on two sides of the graph. You can see that these consumers are going to prefer either something that is average TDS and low PE, or something that's high PE and also average TDS. This is just to show you how we're going to use those techniques to optimize the black coffee we're going to be drip brewing. We can use response surface methodology, and then we can use preference mapping and clustering to do this. So that's the quantitative bit. There are some other methods that I want to run by you because I love to use them on occasion or for specific purposes, and I'll run through them very quickly. One is, and I refer to these as consumer research methods. One is called the repertory grid analysis, another one is called means end chain analysis, and the third one is coin joint analysis. I won't spend time on coin joint because most of you will have heard about that, and it's a market research technique that is used quite extensively, and it allows you to look at what combinations of specific attributes, whether it's the nature of the package, whether the coffee is organic or non-organic, whether it's super pricey or super cheap, which combination appeals most to a particular consumer. That's coin joint analysis. With the repertory grid analysis method, we're interested in understanding consumer perceptions of a product or service through the language that they use to describe it. And then with means end chain analysis, we're going to do something very cool through individual interviews where we ask people why they drink the coffee that they drink. And then we ask a series of why questions to get to what the consumer perceived as key attributes of the product or service, what are the consequences of these key attributes, and then how that connects with their own personal values. A couple of examples. So this is the rep grid method, and the good news here is that with 30 to 50 consumers, you can collect a very meaningful data set. So you don't have to resort to the hundreds that you would require for preference mapping or response surface methodology. So in this case, we have 3 steps, so-called triadic elicitation, where you show different versions of different coffees and you ask them, how are they different? And then the consumer is going to use their own language to describe those differences. Then we take those constructs and we have the consumers rate them in the coffees. And then we apply some multivariate statistics called per-Christes analysis to get a map of those coffees, just like one of the ones we showed you earlier, with the own words of the consumers. And by understanding the words that they use, we can get some key valuable information about how they perceive or how they feel about the product. Another technique that we use quite a bit is means end chain analysis, where we start with a laddering interview technique. And then we ask questions like, why do you drink the coffee that you drink? So the person might say, well, I drink Starbucks coffee because I love the taste. It's familiar to me. And also because we go there with my colleagues for coffee breaks quite often. So then the next question would be, why is the taste of the coffee important to you? And then they would say, well, because, I'm somebody who cares about the way things taste. The flavor is really the most important thing for anything that I drink or eat, and so on and so on. And then you might ask, why is it important for you to go to Starbucks with your colleagues? Well, they might say, well, I need a lot of breaks when I'm working, or I really like to hang out with my colleagues. I'm a very social person. And then you can see how we're going to then be able to connect the attributes to the consequences and then to the personal values of the consumer. So let me show you an example of a means end chain analysis that we carried out on olive oil a few years back. So we asked consumers why they consume the olive oil that they consume, and the kind of answers that we got are outlined at the bottom of this graph in orange. Those are the attributes that came up most of the time. For example, great flavor, or local, or organic. And then we asked them, well, why is it important that the product be local or organic? And then they would tell us, and we can connect them to the consequences in blue. And then we can go all the way up to the personal values of the consumers, like environmental responsibility or hedonism, for those who really derive a lot of pleasure from tasting a particular olive oil. We then get a group that connects those attributes, consequences, and values with arrows, the thickness of which is going to be a function of how often the consumers made those connections. So that's means end chain analysis, or MECA. Now let's get into breakthrough innovation, which in addition to optimization, we promised we would deliver. And in this case, we're talking about creating new segments for a particular, or new categories for a particular product, in our case, coffee. And we do this through one of two techniques, one called empathic design, which I got to experiment with when I was head of consumer research at Danone 20 years ago, and I've continued to use since. Big believer into this approach. And the other one that you might have heard about more recently, which is called design thinking, sort of the Stanford version of it, from the D School and IDEO and author David Kelly. So let's take a look at those techniques and how they came about. And here we're talking about consumer-driven innovation. So in the 1990s, Unilever, giant multinational company, was the first one to place some video cameras in the kitchens of consumers to observe the tea making process. And then they took that one step further, and they placed video cameras in people's showers to observe the shower process to develop shampoo and shower gels. And then today we do what we call ethnography, where we can have you on Zoom while you're preparing your coffee with your Nespresso machine or your La Marzocco Mini. What are the things that we learn from observation, and why are they so valuable? Well, we learn what are the triggers of use, the interactions with the user's environment, what we call user customization. I have some Nespresso machines at home and in my office. Well, the way I brew a capsule of Nespresso is to use the longo setting and then wait a little bit and then go for the short setting as well, the espresso setting. So I get a bigger cup of coffee. Somebody else would say, well, you're not supposed to do that, but that's customization. That's the way I like to do it. We also learn about intangible attributes of the product. What are the things that make the consumer feel a particular way? And then most importantly, we learn about unarticulated user needs. That's sort of the holy grail of market research and consumer research, because if we can meet those needs, then we start, that's when we do breakthrough innovation. Let's also outline briefly design thinking, the process of design thinking, which is somewhat similar to empathic design. First, empathize. Second, define. Then ideate, prototype, and then test. So we start by observing the consumers, by getting some input from those consumers, and different observers draw different solutions to or ideas to meet those particular needs or fixed problems, and then we test the prototypes or the solutions that have been developed. This technique that I've used quite a bit and continue to use, empathic design, how does the process go? So we start with observation. So it can be observation in a cafe of people ordering, of people sitting down and drinking. What are the things that they struggle with as they go through the process or the experience? What we call key learnings. So we need to capture that data as effectively as possible and without intruding into the behavior or interrupting or disturbing the behavior. And we need to do that using different sets of eyes, people who bring different types of backgrounds to the observation piece. Then we reflect and analyze, develop some solutions, and then we test prototypes of possible solutions. And this is really how you get to that breakthrough innovation and the creation of new product categories. I'm just showing an example of a picture. Somebody who has one of those cardboard holders where you can put several cups of coffees. Well, this was to respond to a particular need that became evident once all these specialty coffee shops popped out a few years ago. So I'm going to close with some what I feel are important words of wisdom, what little or how much of it I may have. And that's what I'm calling my keys to market success. And it's really to take the information we've discussed today and to realize that there's going to be two key pieces to us being successful. We might make a great cup of coffee from the best place in the best green coffee from the best hills someplace in the world. But the two things we need to get right, in my opinion, are the market research or the consumer research that is figuring out who your customers are and what they want, most importantly. So don't create a coffee just because you think it's going to be a winner. Check first. See what your consumer wants. And then at the very end of the spectrum is the marketing of that brilliant cup of coffee, or delicious cup of coffee, or coffee drinking experience that you've developed. So market research and marketing, sort of the bookends that keep our shelf of books together, are going to be critical to success. And so we hope to have shown you some techniques to do that most effectively so that you can deliver and give that very special experience to your coffee customer. And with that, I will thank you and acknowledge and thank my collaborators from the UC Davis Coffee Center, Professor Bill Ristenpark, Dr. Molly Spencer, who developed the flavor wheel, Scott Frost, Kenzie Battley, and Andrew Carter, and express our gratitude for the funding that we get to support some of this research from the Specialty Coffee Association and Brevin. Thank you very much.